Good morning. Let me begin by apologizing. I don't have a lot of voice. Beverly and I performed a marriage retreat this weekend. This is the result. I'll let you decide whether that means it went up or downhill. But we'll make it through it if you don't mind me sipping on some water along the way. The texts that you heard Vivian read just a moment ago sound a lot like crisis literature. You could hear the angst in those three passages so easily. But it's not on the crisis where I really want to focus, although that does become important. It's really the remedy that you hear in all three of those texts that become the basis for the gospel and for our lives today. A light shines in the darkness, says Isaiah, right smack in the middle of exile. Matthew picks up that theme, and in his world where things are disintegrating and religious and political powers are clashing and everything seems to be falling apart, light comes into the darkness and suddenly begins to heal them of every disease and every sickness. And a few years later, Paul picks up that theme and looks at a congregation that is marred by distrust and divisions and says to them, the beauty of the gospel sounds like utter foolishness to those who have not been healed, but to those of us who have been, this stewardship of foolishness has everything to do with who we are and who we're becoming. And it's that place I want to take you for these few moments. Pray with me. Bless us, O God, light unto light, light of our lives. You've loved us in so many unique ways. Forgive us for all that we have done and all that we have left undone. And yet draw us out to be a light in this world, reflecting the illumination you bring into our lives. Amen. Let's start with a parable that just happens to be true. It was a July afternoon in Coleman, Texas, population 5,607. It was a particularly hot 104 degrees according to the Walgreens Rexall thermometer. In addition, the wind was blowing that fine-grained Texas sand right through the house. But the afternoon, it was still tolerable, potentially even still enjoyable, because there was a fan that was stirring the air, there was cold lemonade, and finally there was entertainment. Dominoes. Perfect for those kinds of conditions. All in all, it had the makings of an agreeable Sunday afternoon in Coleman. That is, until my father-in-law suddenly said, I have an idea. Let's get in the car and go to Abilene and have dinner at the cafeteria. I thought to myself, what? Go to Abilene, 53 miles in this dust storm and heat, and in an unair-conditioned 1958 Buick? But my wife chimed in with, wow, that sounds good to me. And then added, I just hope Mother wants to go. Well, of course I want to go, chimed in her mother. I haven't been to Abilene in a long time. So into the car, and off to Abilene we went. My predictions were fulfilled. The heat was brutal. Perspiration cemented a fine layer of dust to our skin by the time we arrived. And the cafeteria food, it could have served as a first-rate prop in an antacid commercial. Some 4 hours later, and 106 miles later, we returned to Coleman, hot and exhausted. We sat silently in front of the fan for a long time, and then just to be sociable and to break the silence, I quite dishonestly said, gee, Wasn't that a great trip? No one said a word. Until finally my mother-in-law said, with some irritation in her voice, "Well, to tell the truth, I didn't really enjoy it all that much, and I would have really just rather stayed here. I just went along because the three of you were so enthusiastic about going. I wouldn't have gone at all if you hadn't pressured me into it." I couldn't believe it. "What do you mean, you all?" I said. "Don't put me in the you all group. I was delighted to be doing what we were doing. I didn't want to go. I only went along to satisfy the rest of you. You're the culprits." My wife looked at me shocked. "Don't call me a culprit," she said. "You and Daddy and Mama were the ones who wanted to go. I just went along to keep the rest of you happy. I would have had to been crazy to want to go out in heat like that." Her father expanded on what was absolutely clear. "Listen, I never really wanted to go to Abilene in the first place. I just thought you all might be bored. You visit so seldom, and I wanted to be sure you enjoyed it. I would have preferred to have played another game of dominoes and just eat leftovers out of the refrigerator." And we all sat back in silence. Here were four reasonably sensible people who of our own volition had just taken a 106-mile trip across a godforsaken desert in furnace-like heat and in a dust storm to eat unpalatable food in a hole-in-the-wall restaurant in Abilene when not one of us wanted to go. To be concise, we'd done the opposite of what we'd really wanted to do. And the whole situation made no sense. That little parabolic tidbit is a personal story that's told by Jerry Harvey. He is the emeritus professor of management at the George Washington School of Management. He studies human and group behavior. And based on that experience from his own life, Harvey believes that groups who experience a breakdown in trust sometimes embark on excursions that no member of the group really wants. In fact, he goes so far to say that sometimes they will take actions that are contradictory to what they want or what they believe they should actually do. And in the process, sometimes they wind up defeating the very purposes they were trying to achieve. And when they do, he says, they have stumbled into what he now calls the Abilene paradox. Paul the apostle perhaps thought that his Corinthian community was stumbling toward Abilene when he got word from a group associated with a prominent woman in that congregation named Chloe about problems in that church. Probably no one at First Church Corinth planned what was going on there. There was no grand scheme. There were just lots of little ones. But from those many reasons, their disunity as a congregation was solidifying. And so Paul writes them a letter intent on reconnecting that community by encouraging them to remember, to trust, to act on their faith in God and in one another. If you read the letter to 1 Corinthians, you can see the distrust and the malaise that overtook that church. From their early days as one of Paul's congregations, they became a community that was marred by self-serving behaviors. Behaviors that favored some but not others. Behaviors that privileged and empowered a few but not the many. And behaviors that broke trust rather than building it. Best that we know, Paul wrote to Corinth 4 times, and at least 2 of those letters are in our New Testament. His hope seemed to be that his words would be corrective and that they would help that community ultimately change its course. Sadly for Paul and for Corinth, 100 years later, we have another letter written by a leader of the church named Clement, who once again writes to Corinth, attempting to correct the exact same issues. Sometimes getting off the road to Abilene is really hard. There are patterns, you see, cycles to our lives, and they form and they shape us individually and organizationally. And if we do not attend to those patterns and cycles, they do tend to repeat themselves. And sometimes they can even hold us captive. Ancient Israel learned that lesson. Repetitive patterns of sin and broken promises had left their nation in shambles, overrun by the forces of the Assyrian army. They found themselves on the road to Abilene, far from home and living in a place called exile. And life in Assyria proved difficult for the people of God. There they became suspicious of one another, and they pointed fingers at one another, and they passed along blame over who'd actually gotten them into that situation in the first place. Exile is apparently just down the road from Abilene. I read an article a little while back about a forest ranger in Wales who describes the most common question that visitors to his park tend to ask the forest rangers, because they have lots of people that come to this park to hike the beautiful trails that wander through the forest. And he said the most frequent question that they get isn't where does this trail go, or how long does it take to hike it, or should we bring bug spray along? The most frequent question they get is, excuse me, can you tell me where this trail starts? I suppose that if you have to know where the trail starts in order to get on it, it might be helpful to know where it starts in order to avoid it. Because I doubt that no one in Corinth wanted to wind up in Abilene, and I am clear that Israel would rather have not landed in exile. So maybe the question is, for people like us today, where does this whole road to Abilene start? Well, I think Paul's fairly clear in naming the off-ramp toward Abilene when he says things like this. I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you should be in agreement, and that there should be no divisions among you, but you should be united instead in the same mind and purpose. No divisions, says Paul. Not no differences, but he says no divisions. In other words, Paul says, do the work that is necessary to have the same mind and the same purpose. Unity, trust, community. These are the words that are foundational to Paul's intent in Corinth. Divisions are those things that break down unity, trust, and community. Think about it this way. How many times do you have to feel excluded before your sense of unity begins to erode? How many times can someone break your trust before you start establishing sort of a distance, a safe zone between you and them? How many times can you have a sense that you're not valued in community before that malaise begins to set in and you disengage? Divisions like these plagued the church in Corinth. The situation in Israel was fairly similar. There they found a community divided, cannot stand against any struggles. Leading up to the days before that Assyrian crisis and the exile, the people were divided over small things that diluted their sense of unity and purpose. The decibel level of the constant arguing drowned out voices of reason and faith. The deafening silence and anger roared in their hearts and minds because of suspicion. Divisions like these helped bring ancient Israel to a place called exile. The truth of the matter is that too many times in our own relationships, even in the church, we do things that go against our purpose and unity. And in the process, we dissolve trust, compounding our problems rather than solving them. How many times in your relationships have you found yourself in the place where it seems easier to give in, to just go along to get along, to give up on trying to make a difference or change things, to forget about telling the truth about what you believe is right? How many times have you come to a place where it's easier to deal with the churning in your heart and in your head rather than face the sea of trouble it would take to stand up and speak the truth about what you want and believe in faith? Perhaps no one's expressed that kind of struggle more clearly than Hamlet. To be or not to be, that's the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. When Matthew wrote his gospel in the early 80s of the first century, the tensions in that world were high. A revolt had just taken place 10 years earlier that resulted in the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the rise in power of religious parties. The divisions in those parties were deep, but the proper etiquette of the day demanded that they live and work together. And even though they smiled and made nice as they passed in the hallways of their lives, the disintegration of their community was evident in the malaise that had taken over their hearts. And like Paul's Corinthian church and like the people of ancient Israel, the people of Matthew's day were dealing with broken trust and divided over the future of their faith and their community. So when Matthew describes the start of Jesus' ministry, the gospel writer looks back to that text from Isaiah and describes this presence of Jesus in their world like this: the people who have sat in darkness have seen a great light. And for those who sat in the region and the shadow of death, light has dawned. In the midst of their brokenness and division, the people saw a great light. Several years ago, I was with Beverly and her youth group back in Texas on a camping and caving exploration trip with a whole group of young people. We had an experienced guide with us who was a member of that church, and he brought along his 7-year-old daughter, Kelly Jo. During one part of that journey, our guide took us into a cave that began as a large hole in the side of a hill, but very quickly closed down to a small passageway. Our guide, who was all into leadership and team building and all those kinds of ideas, encouraged us to shut off our lights and use this journey as a learning experience and a trust exercise. In that cave, progress was hard because it soon became a tunnel, and soon we were only able to move forward single file. And the darkness and the steep slope and the small space and our fear and our quickly deteriorating trust in one another took its toll. And our conversation quickly became terse and sometimes heated. Stop pushing! Hurry up! Slow down! Get your hand off me! Our voices betrayed our anxiety, our division, and our fear. but especially our distrust. The cave had become almost completely dark as we were descending down this passageway to a destination we could not see. And suddenly, in the middle of that line, a frail, fearful voice said what all of us were feeling. "Daddy, I'm afraid." It was Kelly Jo, our leader's daughter. And before any of the rest of us had the chance or the nerve to agree with her, her dad's voice came back in calm, reassuring tone. "Kelly Jo, it's okay. I'm right here leading the way." His voice was like a light piercing that darkness. It healed us of our fears, our doubt, our distrust. And in that moment, we became community again. Not just in what we thought, but in how we acted, in the way we treated one another, in who we were becoming. The sighs of relief were audible. Our conversation changed. It became trustful, jovial, bright. We began to help one another and caretake one another. "Here, put your foot right here. There's a hold. Look out for that low rock. Here's a handhold. Oh, let me help you." Our focus became about the community, the process, not the result. And with a very short time, we reached our destination. It was a beautiful cave full of wondrous little crystals and minerals. And as beautiful as they were, they paled in comparison to the light of renewed trust and faithfulness that we had in one another and in our community and in our faith. We became a beautiful community, a sign of Christ's presence. As Jesus began his ministry, Matthew says he went about proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, cursing every disease, curing every disease, and every sickness among the people. Matthew describes him as a light shining in the darkness. Did you know that scientists have shown that in full darkness, the human eye can spot a single candle 30 miles away? 30 miles. That's a long way down the road. So if your life and your faith on the long road, perhaps to Abilene, traveling through some dark night of the soul, going to a place where you really do not want to go, whether you are traveling with others or all by yourself, that light in the darkness may well be good news to you. Because the good news of the gospel is that Christ comes into our lives too, as a light on our darkest days, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, curing us of every disease, every sickness among our community within us. I suspect that no matter what ails us, anything that separates us from the community of faith, anything that divides us, anything that tears us apart, our trust in one another, is really nothing but disease and sickness. Oh, we can take responsibility for where we are, but we need to trust. We need to trust that what we do next is more important than how we got here. Because God cares far more about where we're going than where we've been. And the good news is that Christ is already among us, proclaiming, curing, uniting, forgiving, and calling us to trust in one another and in God. And the cure for what ails us individually and communally is grace. Grace that comes from God, grace that calls us to believe the good news of the gospel, grace that says words like a life connected to God and connected to one another is the most meaningful life there is. Paul says that to many people, the good news of the gospel can sound like foolishness. This crazy idea of asking for and offering forgiveness from God and from one another is sometimes seen as a ridiculous notion. This idea that our community and who we're becoming is far more important than our success. It's a kind of silliness that encourages us to place the welfare and trust of others above ourselves and any ambitious ideas we have. That can sound foolish to anyone who's not been cured of their mistrust, disunity, and faithlessness. But for those of us who are stewards of that kind of foolishness, we are called to live out the belief that even in the darkest night of our soul, even on a desolate road of exile heading towards some place we may not want to go, there is light shining already in the darkness, calling us to be foolish. Foolish enough to believe that we can, through grace, do what others say cannot be done. Foolish enough to believe that forgiveness and love can redeem us, all of us. Foolish enough to believe that trust is more important than success. Foolish enough to believe that grace is greater than all our sin. So in the days ahead, with the light of Christ, His love shining in our lives, perhaps we should spend some time looking one another in the eye, asking for and offering forgiveness, and rebuilding trust, and uniting ourselves around the foolishness of the gospel, so that as stewards of this silly notion, we can faithfully illuminate these ridiculous words. A life connected to God and connected to one another is the most meaningful life there is. Amen.